Guns. They helped America win a nation. Now their lethal force divides us. When freedom exacts a price, how do we decide what to pay? We examine guns and rights on Wyoming Perspectives, the Second Amendment in Wyoming. Hello, I'm Richard Ager. We are at the Cheyenne Frontier Days Old West Museum in Cheyenne. Here, amid the stagecoaches, Indian blankets, and guns, you will find reminders of Wyoming's earliest days. And as you will hear, early settlers in Wyoming also engaged in vigorous debate about limits on gun rights. But now it's your turn. During the next hour, we'll ask you, our viewers, to send in your questions. You can call them in to 1-800-495-9788 or submit questions via Twitter to #WyoGuns. And joining me at the Frontier Days Old West Museum are Phil Roberts, author and professor of history at the University of Wyoming, and Dan Baum, author of the new book, Gun Guys, A Road Trip. Welcome, both of you.
Thank you very much.
Well, first of all, Dan, one of the premises of this program was, of course, to avoid the labels so often attached in this debate, but you've gone to put your identity right on the label. Right
I am a gun guy.
Gun guy with the journey.
But I am a liberal Democrat, New Jersey-born gun guy. So I'm kind of a weird hybrid, which was the genesis of the book.
That could take a few hours to get into. But,
yeah, big Obama fan and a gun guy. So.
Why the journey? We'll get into what you found later, but why this journey?
Well, in part because I have this division within me. I belong to two hostile tribes. I'm as I say, an urban liberal Democrat, born in New Jersey, lived in New York, and I'm a gun guy, lifelong gun guy, since I was 5 years old, summer camp, and I learned how to shoot. So I've always had this division within me, and it kind of is a division that is reflected in the country. And it seemed to me that in all this arguing about guns, the one thing nobody was doing was actually talking to gun guys. The gun controllers were making all kinds of assumptions about gun people that I didn't think were true, weren't true about me.
Just regular gun guys, not
right, regular gun guys. And the NRA was making all kinds of assumptions about gun guys that I didn't think were necessarily true because they didn't apply to me either. So I got in my car, drove around the country, talked to every gun guy I could find. And I found a lot of them.
Well, we'll get into what you found in just a bit. Phil, you've written, of course, and studied a lot of history, also as a veteran of the Marine Corps as well as a professor, and you've had your, obviously, share of time with guns. I hear it's more fishing these days.
It is.
Your take on the current national debate over guns?
Well, my take on it with respect to Wyoming is that a lot of the country doesn't understand Wyoming, and in many respects, as you look through Wyoming history, that's the area that I mainly work in. Through Wyoming history, there have been various misconceptions about what guns are about, because the one thing that sort of got me involved in all of this was the fact that there was so much imaginary history being put out over the past several months about, oh, the Old West, Wyoming in the Old West, where people would strap on their guns and walk downtown to the grocery store, and that's not what Wyoming was like in the pioneer days, or even in the early days of statehood. It was a very different place than that.
Well, we'll get to what you found in just a moment, but you know, as we all know, if you follow the news, you will know that this nation has been very, very much focused on arms, and since the mass killings in Aurora, Colorado, Newtown, Connecticut, the president has unsuccessfully pursued firearms restrictions. The final vote last week was on tightening background checks for gun purchases, and it too failed. Here's the president's reaction.
The current leader of the NRA used to support these background checks. So while this compromise didn't contain everything I wanted or everything that these families wanted, it did represent progress. It represented moderation and common sense. That's why 90% of the American people supported it. But instead of supporting this compromise, the gun lobby and its allies willfully lied about the bill. They claimed that it would create some sort of big brother gun registry, even though the bill did the opposite. This legislation, in fact, outlawed any registry. Plain and simple, right there in the text. But that didn't matter. And unfortunately, this pattern of spreading untruths about this legislation served a purpose, because those lies upset an intense minority of gun owners, and that in turn intimidated a lot of senators.
Well, lies, not language, Phil, normally used by the president.
I would liken that very much to some of the imaginary history that we heard in our state over the past several months concerning guns, and some of the attitudes of our members of Congress concerning guns. Here I'm a native of Wyoming, and after all, Wyoming's the home to the one-shot antelope hunt. And we've always had a gun culture with respect to hunting, but we value the guy who can actually hit the target, not the guy who has to have a banana clip to 30 shots or so to hit the bullseye. So it seems to me that there's a lot of common sense wrapped up in what the president was arguing, and indeed it wouldn't have been all that foreign to early Wyomingites with respect to that, because those early Wyomingites didn't have their firearms to shoot each other. They had them for hunting purposes, for in the rare cases where there were law enforcement incidents like the Johnson County War, they might have firearms at the ready, but it wasn't a common thing to be out gunning for your neighbor.
You know, Dan, in your book, speaking about the tone of the debate as we go into this, you described Biff the angry gun dealer.
Yes.
Who blamed Obama
Biff
for everything.
Right. I met a lot of very angry gun guys. The president is right about the NRA lying about about the background check bill. He is right, but he is not. He went into this really unaware of how this whole debate strikes the ears of gun guys. I mean, to gun guys to be told, we trust you with this kind of gun, but we don't trust you with this kind of gun. We trust you with this many rounds in your magazine, but not this many rounds in your magazine. They hear that and they say, now, the president's a smart guy. Dianne Feinstein's a smart woman. She must know that reducing the number of rounds in a magazine is not really going to make anybody safer. So she must have something else that's motivating her. And what's motivating her is she doesn't like me. She is expressing disapproval of me. She is expressing mistrust of me. And gun guys hear that, and it's like, Ms. Feinstein, Mr. President, you don't know guns. You don't know me. You don't hang out with gun guys. You are presuming to make rules about something you don't understand for people you don't know. And they hear that, and they just shut down. So they were predisposed to reject anything that was coming from those folks. So the background check bill, even though I think the president is right, a lot of gun guys I've met would have supported the background check bill, it came wrapped with an assault rifle ban, and it came wrapped with the limits on magazine size. And those two things, for gun guys, it was like, why on earth do you think that's going to make us safer in a country that already has 330 million guns in circulation? So if that's not going to make us safer, what are you really doing? Now, I'm just telling you, this is what gun guys would tell me.
Is there a sense that we've seen this before? I mean, Phil, so much anger, such a lot to go around. But, back in 1994, when the first so-called assault weapons ban was passed, the Democrats paid a heavy price. Mm-hmm. Yes. It expired 10 years later, but it took longer than that for the Democrats to recover. But the anger that was unleashed during that time...
I would say they still haven't recovered. I met them, excuse me, but I met on this trip all over the country, natural Democrats, working guys, lunch bucket guys who should be Democrats. These are the people that the Democratic Party is organized to represent. They build statues to these people, and they will not listen to the Democrats about anything. Immigration, climate change, women's rights, reproductive rights, anything, because of the Democrats' institutional hostility to guns.
Reagan Democrats.
Yeah, so as a Democrat, it would just break my heart, you know, to see this, because these are our people, and yet they hate us because of our institutional
How do you
hostility
see
to
that
guns.
reflected here in Wyoming, where it's basically one-party rule, but always hasn't been?
Well, part of it is the fact that this particular, I would submit, small but very vocal minority of folks are pretty much given a national forum at this point, and in respect to some of these organizations like the NRA and the gun owners of Wyoming, those are pretty recent additions to the political scene in Wyoming. These single interest, these single issue voters haven't been all that common in Wyoming history. Even with respect to abortion rights, for example, we haven't had the same level of single issue voters that other places have had. So I think it's quite a bit different. Guns are a little different
because I think the gun debate stands in for this bigger debate, this tension that goes through all of American history, is to what extent are we individuals, or to what extent are we members of a collective? And the gun represents the individual. The gun makes the individual sovereign. And I would also submit that, you know, the bulge of the gun guy demographic is if you look at industry statistics about who buys and uses guns, it's middle-aged white men who haven't finished college, which is a demographic that has fared particularly poorly in this country in the last 30 years. So the gun represents a lot of things to these guys, and to be told you are not to be trusted with this gun or that gun, it pushes every button they've got.
Well, there was a lot of button pushing actually going on at the legislature in Wyoming and other legislatures around the country, of course. And it was just during this past session with a number of bills. The language of one of the bills at the Wyoming House could have led to armed standoffs between state and federal law enforcement officers. Let's take a listen.
If our federal government chooses to commit treason against the people of this country, it's incumbent on the states to hold the federal government in check.
If the state of Colorado and Washington state can say no to federal drug laws, why can't the state of Wyoming do the same as it pertains to gun laws?
If everyone would stand for these guys to let them know that you're in support of this bill.
Well, show of organized support there, as you can see. I would say that during that week...
That's about more than guns.
Well,
that's
they
about more
actually
than
had,
guns. That's about the federal government and the states. That's what I'm saying. The guns stand in for these other debates that are sometimes harder to have.
There's a little bit of imaginary history going on there, too.
Yes.
Because
yes,
after all, Wyoming is a product of the post-Civil War America with the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, and I would submit that the analogy that you just posted about community and individual didn't appear quite that way to your usual citizen in Wyoming in the 19th century and the early part of the 20th. And I would base that simply on some things.
They felt more like part of a collective.
Well, not so much part of a collective as the fact that that if within your community, your main goal in establishing the community is to have a community that is safe, that is that rule of law prevails, and that you're going to have some mechanism for law enforcement to be able to keep out the dangerous outsider.
Well,
maybe is a better
I've
way
been
of
to the
putting it.
movies. The movies don't make it sound
totally
like that at all in
imaginary.
Wyoming.
Yeah,
I know,
it's totally imaginary. It's just amazing.
You know,
it really is.
Another bill at the legislature, Phil, would have denied cities and towns the right to declare a gun-free zone in a school or a town hall meeting. Sort of like 6 guns anywhere, just like the old days. And of course, you did a little research and found otherwise. Tell us about it.
Well, in the old days, it wasn't that way, because I looked through various ordinances for the the early cities in Wyoming, and I went through just about every old ordinance book that you could find of various Wyoming towns, and with only one exception, one of the very first ordinances passed in any of these communities was an ordinance that, in essence, banned guns from the city limits. That if you came into town as...
In Wyoming?
Yes, yes. And in fact, the one in Cheyenne was put on the books fully just 80 days after the town magically appeared from the plains, just 80 days after Grenville Dodge had picked the spot for the town. The very first city council stated that, that we do not want to have people walking around our community armed to the teeth. You need to check in your gun with the marshal.
And do you know, was that because there was there a Wild West? Was there a lot of gunplay that the towns were reacting to, or was this preemptive?
Well, absolutely, because the Hell on Wheels towns that were following the construction of the railroad, there were all of these elements that were following the Hell on Wheels, or establishing these Hell on Wheels towns and following the construction of the railroad. But one fairly interesting aspect of that is that the railroad supervisors banned guns on the part of their construction workers, because there are two things that they didn't want their construction workers to do. One was to run around drunk, and so they banned liquor out on the sites. And the other thing was they didn't want them to run around drunk with guns.
But I'll bet organizing,
I
too,
have to
was
ask
another
here,
thing they didn't
because are you saying that possibly this might have to be renamed not the Wild West Museum?
Oh, I think
if all these towns were that well regulated?
No, I think there's plenty of Wild West to it, but the overall view of individuals who finally established communities, they established those communities so that they could get away from that kind of violence.
Okay.
That was their purpose.
Just a reminder to our viewers, you can send in your questions. Call them in at 1-800-495-9788, or submit questions via Twitter at WyoGuns, hashtag WyoGuns. And I have one here, and that is getting into questions on your book. Dan, you say that gun owners would be better securing their firearms with proper safes. Do you think that everyone who owns a gun needs to have a true safe in order to protect their gun?
I do. I have a piece coming out in Harper's Magazine in a few days, and I talk about this. I think we have this gun debate screwed up in this country, obviously. Nobody's getting what he wants. It's going nowhere. I think we have to flip the script. Right now, gun law is all predicated on the idea that gun owners are a problem. And we have to pass laws to ameliorate the problem, keep gun owners in a smaller and smaller box, prune them back as much as we can. When really, I think we should be thinking of gun owners as an asset. They are the custodians of our civilian arsenal. We have 300 million guns in this country, maybe more. It is the gun guys who own them. And when we can continuously treat them with disrespect and insult them with saying you can be trusted with this gun or that gun, and pass these laws that really aren't going to make us safer, what we're telling them is you're a problem, we don't value you. And in fact, quite frankly, gun guys, I would say because I include myself in this, we are criminally lousy stewards of the nation's civilian arsenal. Every time something bad happens with a gun, it happens with a gun that somebody bought legally, a law-abiding citizen bought legally, and then he lost control of it. A kid found it, a depressed teenager found it, a thief got it, and then something bad happens with the gun. So I, personally, and this is just me talking, I think yes, gun guys need to have safes. I think gun guys need to lock up their guns. I think your gun either needs to be on your hip or locked in a safe. Not in your glove compartment, not in the nightstand, not in the closet. There are quick opening safes. I have one that open instantly when you push a code. So if you need the gun in a hurry, you can get it. But this business of leaving guns around is toxic. And you know, I think the segment of the country that hates guns should support a tax credit for buying a safe. I think we all need to become allies in making this country safer. The question should not be, how can we ban more guns in the future? The question to me should be, how can we all live more safely in a country with 300 million privately owned guns? We're not going to round them up. So how do we live more safely with all these guns? And I think it starts with the gun guys. I think we have to be better stewards of those guns.
Well, you know, our program title, of course, is the Second Amendment. I'm not sure if we should order up a fife and drum here, but we do need to talk about the Second Amendment. And it reads, and I'll just read it, a well-regulated militia, comma, being necessary to the security of a free state, comma, the right of the people to keep and bear arms, comma, shall not be infringed. Yeah. Well, Phil, you're the historian, so what does that mean?
What the hell does that mean?
Well, the Supreme Court finally, just fairly recently, has concluded that that is in fact a personal right rather than a militia right. But the days that I'm talking about in Wyoming history in the 19th century and throughout the early part of the 20th century, there was certainly a good number of people who viewed it as a militia right, and a very good example is at the time of the Johnson County invasion, when an illegal army was mounted down here in Cheyenne, and you know the story, by the acting governor of Wyoming, Amos Barber, was involved in it, and lots of the leading citizens, including 3 drafters of the Wyoming Constitution. And they marched on Buffalo, and the citizens of Buffalo heard they were coming, and what did they do? They didn't pull guns out of their closets. They went down to Robert Foote's store, who was the general store owner, and he handed out rifles to these individuals, and they went out and were ready to confront the invaders.
They did not have their own guns.
They didn't have their own guns.
No guns in the
By and large,
fireplace,
they didn't
I
have
guess.
their own guns. Now, of course, this is in town.
Right.
Now, on the ranches, on the homesteads, sure, there are going to be guns out on the ranches and the homesteads. You've got not just rattlesnakes and coyotes to deal with, but you've got meat on the table, and who knows?
Well,
there might be somebody coming over the hill that,
Right.
Militia,
might be a little bit
the amendment
unsavory.
is now a few hundred years old, so I'll just read this from one of our viewers, from Marion in Laramie, and she asks, how can anyone believe that the Second Amendment deals with weapons of mass destruction, silencers, etc.? I wish she had defined a little more what she meant by weapons of mass destruction.
You know, the Second Amendment argument, and this is going to be anathema probably to a lot of your viewers, but forgive me on this. I think the Second Amendment is irrelevant, quite frankly. Nobody agrees on what it means. I mean, look at this. New York State, Rhode Island, Maryland, Colorado passing gun bans after these Supreme Court decisions that you talk about, Heller and McDonald, in which the court explicitly said gun bans, in Scalia's words, are off the table.
Yep.
So even now, those who don't like guns do not accept the validity of the Second Amendment. They just don't. They don't value their Second Amendment rights because they don't exercise them, and they just choose to pretend it doesn't exist. The gun guys, for their part, for them, the discussion begins and ends with their Second Amendment rights, which I think is wrong, because I think we have responsibilities as well. So I would argue it really doesn't matter what James Madison wanted in terms of guns. What matters is what we want in this country.
You've imagined, you know, when you look at
Who knows?
the
I
immense
have read,
difference in weapons
I mean, you're a
these days.
historian. I have read a stack of books about the political and economic conditions at the time the Second Amendment was written. People trying to interpret, what were they trying to say? It is the most opaque of the 10 amendments in the Bill of Rights. Nobody has a ghost of a clue what it really means or what the founders meant by it, right? So, and this set of scholars of this stack of books says it means the militia right. This set of scholars over here says it means an individual right. The Supreme Court has ruled. Nobody's paying attention to that.
You did
So
make
it's
note,
irrelevant.
You did make note in your book when you visited the NRA museum that when you visited, it was only the second half
Exactly.
of the amendment that was mounted over the door. I guess
The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be
that
infringed.
militia part must have been in a storeroom upstairs somewhere.
Exactly. So to me, and I make this argument to my fellow gun guys all the time, it's a loser of an argument. You can stand on a table and scream about your Second Amendment rights all day long. The other side doesn't hear it. They don't want to hear it. They don't accept it. They don't accept it as legitimate. Let's drop it. Let's not talk about what James Madison wanted. Let's talk about what we want. And I would say we gun guys want to continue to be able to buy and trade and sell and own and use the firearms we want to use in a responsible manner. And the other side really wants to be safer in this country. We want fewer people to get killed. We can do that, but we can't do it while we're having this tribal battle, one against the other. It drives me crazy. We're getting nowhere.
Well, I mean, clearly, the town fathers of the early cities in Wyoming had no compunctions about issuing those restrictions, you know, in their town ordinances, probably not worrying at all that they would ever make it to the Supreme Court.
They never had any doubt that they could do something like that, because in most of the cases, as I've looked up, it was from the impetus was coming from law enforcement in the counties and in the cities, because it was the town marshal, it was the county sheriff who was most concerned with the misuse, the irresponsible gun owner, if you will.
Right.
And it was...
You see that today?
Yes.
Sure.
You do. Although police officers, it's interesting. Police chiefs will always say that they support gun control, but police chiefs are political appointees. You ask uniformed officers, and they're almost universally against it. There was just a poll by the website Police One, a cop website. Something like 90% of police officers oppose gun bans, support concealed carry. The sheriffs are the same way because they're elected. Gun ownership and gun rights, they go really deep. People take it seriously.
Just another note to our viewers, of course. If you'd like to send in your questions, call them in to 1-800-495-9788 or submit questions via Twitter to WyoGuns. Do you own a gun? Do you think that your rights as a gun owner are well protected? Let us know what you think. We have a question here from Dennis in Cheyenne, and he wants to know, it's not the guns, but the root of who is using the guns and their mindset. When we as adults try to teach our children it's wrong to kill, but then our children watch violent video games, what can be done about that?
Well, we've been watching violent movies in this country for an awfully long time. I'm not
and stage plays before then.
And stage plays before then, exactly. I'm a First Amendment guy. I'm a First Amendment guy, and this idea of restricting video games, I think, is misguided. I mean, we are a violent country. I mean, you're a historian. It was occurring to me the other day. Our history teaches us over and over and over that violence works. He who is the most violent wins. We got our independence
you made
through
an
violence.
observation in your book, actually, that said that maybe the reason that our gun laws are so ineffective is that we want them to be ineffective.
I think that's probably true. I think
Well,
that's probably true.
I think the founding fathers and mothers of Wyoming towns that wrote up these ordinances, though, probably didn't have that same view. They viewed violence as something that wasn't going to be positive toward the development of their communities, and if anything, it showed more of a skepticism about those who were not following the rules, and normally those were people who were coming in from somewhere else.
And I think we have that impulse in us as well. But for some reason, we are a violent people in this country, and we glorify it over and over and over.
You know, I mean, even when we set up something like an instant background check, and there is an existing background check, obviously,
right.
But this is recent from 2011, the number of mental health records that are submitted in order to, of course, screen out those people who are inappropriate for any gun purchases. Texas submitted 174,000 mental health records to the registry in 2011. Colorado, 27,000 records. Wyoming, 4.
Well, you know, that's a tough one, because you don't want to criminalize mental health. You don't want to stigmatize people with mental health problems. I've done a lot of writing about combat veterans when I was writing for The New Yorker. And combat veterans coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq are not seeking treatment for PTSD because they don't want to lose their gun rights. So you don't want to drive people away from treatment. You don't want to make it clear to people that if you seek treatment for mental health problems, you're going to lose your rights. So this is a tough one.
But
I
this
think
is a
it's- I think
systemic lack of cooperation as well, too.
Yeah, I
There,
think
there are
it's-
no mechanisms built in this state that there are
Well,
in all of
I
these
think it's
other
kind of
what is a mental
interesting.
health problem? I mean, I've
Yeah.
had insomnia. Should I be barred from ever owning a gun?
No,
I don't
a pillow
know.
maybe. Maybe a pillow.
Yeah, I mean, you know,
Well,
I mean, I
think-
think people who are depressive, you know, should be very careful about having guns around. But that's a tough one.
Well, I think it's interesting what you say because Wyoming has the highest incidence of gun ownership of any state in the union, and yet it has one of the lowest levels of gun violence of any state in the union. And so that
it's
would
not a
suggest to
very
me
dense population.
that while we might be a violent country, the place that you would fully expect to be more violent than anywhere else, the old west of Wyoming, has a lower incidence than almost anywhere else. So
Yeah, that
it
is
doesn't
interesting.
necessarily correlate gun ownership and
Or gun
and
laws.
violence.
New York and Chicago both have really tough gun laws. And New York has very low violent crime, and Chicago has very high violent crime.
And you look at these city ordinances in the Wyoming towns, and the 9 or 10 that I identified in the 19th century, and during that period, there were you could count on one hand the number of murders that occurred in those in any of
That's
those
great.
towns.
That is fascinating. You got to write that book. I'm looking forward. I'm looking forward to reading that book. That's really
Yeah,
interesting stuff.
I think it's
That
some
is
of the
really
I think some of the mythology is that we were a very violent place in the 19th century. And one interesting thing about Cheyenne, here we are in the Cheyenne Frontier Days Old West Museum celebrating the Old West, and really the only authenticated case in which there was a typical Hollywood-style gunfight on the main street of Cheyenne. The two people standing off against each other were railroaders. They weren't cowboys, they were railroaders.
Wow.
And each of them emptied their pistols and didn't even hit the other. I mean, they were coming out of a bar, and they were obviously lousy shots. And
So they
you know,
emptied
the
their pistols and
stereotype.
then went back inside and started drinking again together?
Well,
or did they...
I don't think the newspaper goes so far as to say that they became buddies again, but it's not the stereotype that you would expect to see
Yeah.
some 30 years
Our only
later in
authentic,
Hollywood.
gunfight, and it had a happy ending. Unbelievable. Well, in this case, we print the truth, not the legend, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Yeah.
We have a caller, Rod from Cheyenne. He has a question, and what he says is, I don't feel that I should have to carry a gun in order to feel safe. And I have to say that in reading your book, you went through these months of getting used to having a concealed carry permit and carrying a weapon, and how that made you feel, how it made you have a different attitude.
It
as-
changes
as you were
everything.
doing.
It changes how the world looks
I'll
entirely.
finish Rod's question. I feel threatened when I see someone carrying openly with in a restaurant. I feel the government is not keeping it safe by allowing large capacity magazines. They're unnecessary. We need to restrict them to 5 rounds like most rifles. Well, where would you
Okay.
like to start on that one?
And I would say, again, I hate to keep going back to historical analogy, but certainly in the early days of Wyoming, he probably expressed a very similar view that
That's what it sounds like.
Early city councilmen in nearly every town in Wyoming
He would have been the respected citizen. What does
He
anybody
doesn't.
need
He
that
doesn't
from?
want to
He
see.
didn't
He
want
doesn't want to
that.
see cowboys or anyone doesn't want
Well,
to
he
see
doesn't-
people walking around with guns on their hips.
And he doesn't want to have to feel concerned as he's going off to do
Right.
whatever he is doing downtown.
Right.
But of course, one really interesting thing about early violence in Wyoming that we all also have to keep in mind is that there were certain neighborhoods in most of these towns where there were lots of bars, there were lots of gambling joints and other such places, and you could find violence in these towns. If you wanted to get into trouble, there was a pretty good place for it. And I think there have been a couple of books on some districts in Wyoming. Walter Jones did a thing on the Sandbar district in Casper, which is a wild and woolly place.
But it was broken bottles and knives. It was not guns.
Well, it usually was broken bottles and knives, but anytime
So
there was
much better.
anytime there was any sort of gun violence, it was not that spontaneous random act like we have these days with these tragic theater and school shootings. That wasn't the way it happened. A lot of times in Wyoming, what would happen is a couple of neighbors would start fighting over water, and it would escalate and escalate, and pretty soon they'd be whacking on each other with shovels, and then it would get a little more serious, and one of them would end up shooting the other one. So that was more or less the level of
Well, we
of
still
the
have
violence.
fights over water. You know, Dan, one of the biggest issues of this whole debate has been over the gun show loophole. But you wrote that actually a much bigger loophole exists that nobody really talks about.
Well,
that
that's what they were trying to do with the background check bill. Is right now, if I wanted to sell you a gun, I could sell you a gun, no questions asked, and nobody knows what percentage of gun sales are done that way. Between friends, between strangers, you show up at my house with cash, I give you a gun. I've bought guns that way. I've sold guns that way. And the idea was that all these sales should have to go through a background check, and that's what failed. And
Did you feel good about doing that, selling it like that,
No.
and buying it like
No.
that?
No, I think the background check idea was a good one. I would have amended it because to ask people to go to a gun store, which may be many miles away in Wyoming, you may have to drive 2 or 3 hours to get to a gun store in Wyoming, and then pay $25 and wait around in the gun store for maybe a few hours for the background check to come back. You don't want to pass laws that people won't obey. I think it is injurious to public order to pass laws that many people won't obey.
Like the 55-mile-an-hour.
Perhaps, yes, the 55 mile an hour. It engenders disrespect for the law. So what I would have amended the background check law to say, put the instant background check on the internet where everybody can get it. And you want to buy a gun from me, come to my house, we run the background check on you, it comes up clean. I should have to print that piece of paper out and hold that piece of paper, say for 10 years, the way gun stores do. There's no central registry, there's no central database, but I have a record. In case that gun shows up at a crime scene, I can say, hey, look, when I sold it to Richard, it was a legitimate sale. That might have worked, but again, that was not going to work in this climate. That was not going to work at the same time we were talking about assault rifle bans and magazine capacity limits. It just was not going to fly.
Reminder to our viewers, we'll get that in a second there, Phil. Send in your questions. You can call in your questions at 1-800-495-9788 or submit them via Twitter to #WyoGuns. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think you're probably overestimating the distance in Wyoming between gun stores.
Maybe.
I think
Maybe
that
I am.
may
I used
be-
to live in Montana.
Uh-huh.
And there are places in Montana where you'd have to drive a good long way to get to a gun store.
Yeah, and of course, if you're living way out in the on the ranches in Wyoming, maybe you'd be a ways out. But I think just about every Wyoming town has a nearby gun store, so I don't know there's a problem.
Here's a question from Marion in Laramie, and it's one I've heard before, but I think it bears repeating, and that's simply, why does the average person need big clips and Uzis? Now, you're a collector, so...
I like early 20th century guns. So I myself do not own an AR-15 and a 30-round clip, but not because I think they're evil, just because I don't like them. But this question about why does anybody need, we don't ask it in any other context. We don't ask, why does anybody need a 6,000 square foot house? We don't ask, why does anybody need an 8-cylinder SUV? And I would argue both of those things may be doing us, may be limiting our future more than the AR-15 rifle. The AR-15, which is the gun that was all the excitement is about, 1 in 5 guns in America being sold now is an AR-15. It is the most popular gun in America. People use it for all kinds of shooting, hunting, target shooting, sport shooting, self-defense. It is not some bizarre outlier to the gun business. It is the whole gun business. It is enormously profitable. It is enormously popular. So the gun guys say, who needs an AR-15? Everybody needs an AR-15.
I think advertising works.
And
It's
all the
profitable.
Advertising works, and
equipment
you know what's the best advertising for the AR-15 is the news, because every soldier you see is holding an AR-15, and they're all tricked out with all kinds of cool accessories. It's in the book somebody calls it Barbie for men, because you can buy all these wonderful accessories.
And you
for it.
pointed out that actually it wasn't the Army that bought those accoutrements in a lot
No,
of cases.
the soldiers buy them themselves.
So mothers, fathers.
Yes. So,
Here, son,
so
here's
it
a
is,
big scope.
in answer to the viewer's question, it is, not only is it the most popular gun in America, it does not differ mechanically from many, many guns that you would say, oh, that's a nice gun. That's a good person's gun. I don't want to ban that gun. The AR-15, it's ugly, it's black, it looks evil, it's got plastic instead of nice wood.
So
but
good
it
gun,
is-
bad gun.
Good gun, bad. The good gun, bad gun thing is it's cosmetic.
It's
and
the value of
silly.
advertising all along, though,
It's
too.
the value of
So-
advertising. It is also an extraordinary rifle to shoot. It's popular for the same reason the iPhone is popular. It is the most high-tech iteration of this technology. If you want the latest and greatest rifle, that's the rifle you buy.
When we talk about firearms, of course, traditionally, we think of hunters,
Yes.
big group of them.
Which is a small
Well, you
part of the-
you would think that everybody who would own firearms might have a lot in common. But in fact, as you point out, a lot of gun enthusiasts don't have a lot of regard for hunters. They call them
FUDs.
FUDs,
FUDs.
as in
Elmer
Elmer
Fudd.
Fudd.
Yeah, because kind of like your viewer, what you'll often hear the gun control side say is, nobody needs an AR-15 to hunt deer, or nobody needs a 30-round clip to go hunting. And what they're doing is they're setting up hunting as the only legitimate use of firearms. And gun guys hear that and say, well, who's talking about hunting? Hunting is a small part of firearms enthusiasm. And if you hold up hunting as the only legitimate use of firearms, well, then you're saying all the other uses of firearms
Well, I
is
think a lot of
illegitimate.
people, when
Uses
they engage in
target-
this, right?
Target shooting.
Target shooting, just fun, just going out and shooting cans. I mean, there's
vandalizing stop signs or road signs in
well,
Wyoming.
vandalizing stop
Which
signs.
is really
I guess
big.
there is a
is
lot
really-
of that.
yeah.
There's a lot of irresponsible use of guns, no question about it. But I mean, a lot of people own guns just because they like them. They're fun. They're cool. They enjoy them even when they're not shooting them. They like taking them apart and putting them back together. I mean, the attraction of firearms is deep and complicated, and this
And
debate
hard for a
makes
lot
it
of people to
very
understand,
and
obviously,
this
obviously.
debate makes it very simplistic, and people who have a complicated enthusiasm feel talked down to when it is all made simplistic and when they are demonized.
Wayne from Laramie calls in to point out that Wyoming has the highest suicide rate in the country by firearms. And isn't that related
That's right.
to
Well,
It's
the thing about
it's the
live by them,
availability.
die by them?
yeah,
It's
I
the
mean,
availability. We
and
don't
the thing
have a
about
lot
a
of-
gun, you
We
try
don't
to
have a lot of 30-story buildings.
Yeah, yeah,
and
road.
I don't mean to,
Build
I
more
don't mean
bridges
to trivialize it, because I think it does say something about the incidence of
well, the
of
problem
guns
with
in
gun
Wyoming.
suicide is when
It's
you try to
pretty
commit
final.
yourself with a gun, you
It's final.
almost always succeed. Whereas when you try to do it with exhaust or pills, you often don't.
That's right. It's much more final.
Yeah.
Here's sort of a modern versus historical question for you. This is from Jared. Why did Wyoming enshrine the Second Amendment in our Constitution as an individual right when we were virtually anti-gun as a frontier territory?
Well,
Was it just pro forma, do you think?
I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that it was true of freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and freedom from religion, both included in the Declaration of Rights in the Wyoming Constitution, and they incorporated the whole Bill of Rights in one place or another in the Declaration of Rights in the Wyoming Constitution. Those guys had 25 days to put this thing together, and they were going to make sure that all that got in there. I'm sure that they took a look at the language of the Second Amendment in the U.S. Constitution and scratched their collective heads and said, well, what really does that mean? We have an entire article in the Wyoming Constitution on the militia, and we set that up in the Constitution. By the way, we did it in a weird way. Here we were giving women equal rights and the right to vote and hold office, etc. And in the militia article, it says that only male citizens between the ages of 18 and 40 are obligated to serve in the militia. But we already had that section. Didn't need to incorporate that other kind of language.
But it is interesting. I think what the viewer was asking is, you enshrine in the state constitution, as it is in the national constitution, the right to keep and bear arms.
Sure.
And then you have towns saying, yes, you have a right to keep and bear arms, but not in our town.
Yes, because I think what all the way through those declarations of rights. I think it was widely understood that there is such a thing as responsible regulation, and it's not just during the territorial period that those ordinances are passed, because some of the towns where I was looking at the ordinances, those were passed in the early part of the 20th century. But even getting back to the Constitution, not everything that was enshrined in the Constitution has been adhered to much or listened to, and there are at least 2 places in the Wyoming Constitution that states that the U.S. Constitution shall be the supreme law of the land. That's in there twice.
Wow.
There's even one section in the Wyoming Constitution that says that all federal land within the state of Wyoming shall remain the property of the state of the federal government, because in exchange for statehood, we are hereby waiving any right, title, and interest
Brother,
to the land.
you keep talking like this in Wyoming, you're going to get tarred and feathered.
No, I mean it just because it's in there, because it's in there doesn't really reflect
But it is,
that it's
but it
going
is
to be.
something that comes up with gun guys all the time. They will say, "What part of do not infringed don't you understand?"
Well, there we are. See, there's the
What part
there
of
is the-
well-regulated don't you understand?
See, there
I'm
is
sure
the-
it comes back right
Yeah.
at them.
See, there is the there again is the absolutist aspect of
Right.
you know, like Hugo Black talking about the late Supreme Court justice who was an absolutist when it came to the First Amendment on free speech. He didn't see any particular reason why the old saw that's not actually part of anything but dicta in the Supreme Court about yelling fire in a theater. He didn't see that as a particular problem, because the Constitution, in the view of Hugo Black, said Congress shall not pass any law
Abridging freedom of speech.
freedom of speech.
And
Absolutely.
speaking of speech, we have another question from Joyce in Fort Washakie. And she is asking, why aren't we talking about women who like to own guns? In Wyoming, there's a lot of gun women, not just gun guys. And she takes an exception to us just talking about guys. We weren't just talking about guys, were
You
we?
know, the women I have met who like guns often call themselves gun guys. So that's why I called the book Gun Guys.
Oh, nice response.
But I do have a woman shooter in here. In fact, an awesome woman in Kentucky who looks just like Sarah Palin and competes with a submachine gun. She's incredible and does this running and gunning thing with a submachine gun, and she is something to watch. You know, the thing about women in shooting, obviously there are a lot of women who shoot. It seems to be about 10% of the shooting population is female, and it has been that way for a long time. The NRA has made a big push to try to get more women to shoot, and it doesn't seem to do much. About 10% of the shooting population is women.
Statistics I read, it's about a third or so, women compared to men. There's about 3 times as many men
Really?
who
The
who
industry
participate. The
says
hunting-
about 10%.
Well, the game and fish department here has been pushing to increase female participation, as I think a lot have around the nation.
Every year, the Colorado hunting regs, the photo on the cover is a woman with an elk.
But every year, you run into the problem that they're running out of revenues because the number of licenses are going down. And you started to address this in your book as well, because the entire participation of shooting sports, in fact, is a declining event.
Young people, if you look at the industry statistics, and this is the thing I say that gets me tarred and feathered, young people have very little discernible interest in guns. Now, that's maybe not true in Wyoming.
Well, hunting has to be handed down, basically.
I think
And-
so.
Right, hunting has to be handed down. Fewer and fewer people hunt. The young people who hunt want to hunt with bows and arrows. They don't want to hunt with rifles. Bows and arrows, it's more extreme. It's more skill involved. To the extent young people want to hunt, it's with bows. But young people want to be urban and digital. And if you look at the industry statistics of who buys guns, people in their 20s, it's tiny. And so I fear that 25 years from now, this argument about gun rights and gun politics is going to be like arguing about temperance. That there just isn't going to be much gun culture.
Well,
Now, maybe in Wyoming, maybe different.
Here's a stunning number that I ran into. The General Social Survey, which has been tracking gun ownership since 1973.
Right.
Last year, found out that gun ownership is declining around the nation, but I was really stunned by this. In the mountain region, states like Montana, New Mexico, and Wyoming, it dropped to under 40% from more than 65%
Of
in the
households.
1970s of households. The Northeast is much lower even than that, but
Right.
that's expected because
Yes.
that's been the historic trend. But
More
here,
and more guns
where there's
are
a lot
being
of gun
sold
culture,
to fewer and fewer people.
That's right.
So,
So that was the gun rush.
in that same period, the number of privately owned guns doubled, but it was this shrinking cohort of
That's right.
people building their collections. It's not, young people don't want any part of it.
I'm going to read a quote from your book, Dan, saying, perhaps part of the rage I was encountering was born of panic. The gun rights movement seemed to be making a flamboyant and belligerent show of themselves, precisely the way a flower grows intensely fragrant just before it dies.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, well, that I definitely got that vibe as I was going around. You know, I would talk to these, they call them, look on the blogs. They often refer to themselves as OFWGs, old fat white guys. That's how they talk about themselves. And gun culture is aging. And I think that's a pity, because I actually think gun ownership is a good thing. I think the shooting sports can be a really disciplining, positive thing for young people. So I actually lament this. I think it would be a pity. I think gun culture needs to get smarter and more responsible and whatnot, but I don't want it to go away, and it certainly seems to be.
You know, we have a comment here from Rita from Casper. She says, the reason that people have guns is to protect themselves. She also thinks that people are fighting the gun laws as they are because they're tired of Obama trying to control them. Phil, I'll pass that one to you.
To protect themselves. How interesting, because it's at least in Wyoming and historically it's been in fact the idea that the fewer guns there are in town, the more protected you are. It's not the fact that you can somehow draw fast on somebody breaking into your house. It often, as Dan alluded to earlier, it's often the accidental use of that gun rather than the gun being used as a defensive weapon that causes all the trouble.
I think we saw a lot of that happen after Newtown, when school administrators must have been thinking, gosh, if only somebody had been armed, on the location.
Yeah, it's funny, we're ambivalent about that. I think we all wish there happened to have been an off-duty cop there that day dropping off his kid who could have drawn his gun and stopped that. And yet, many people are made very uncomfortable by the idea of armed citizens walking around, perhaps being on the scene when something bad happens. This is a tough one.
Well, if you recall with the Gabby Gifford incident down in
Right.
Tucson, there was a young man there that did have a gun with him, and he was afraid to pull it out because he said he didn't know who the shooter was, and it was very likely that law enforcement, seeing him pull the gun out, might actually mistake him for the
Right.
shooter.
No,
But what I thought was
So-
interesting about that was he acted with a very cool head.
He did. He did.
And I thought that spoke very well of him.
It did.
Big reason, obviously, we're doing this is the politics of it. That same survey about gun ownership found that Republicans actually have more guns in their homes. It's actually up from surveys done through 2006. Democrats, half that
Don't
number.
ask me to explain Republicans.
Is that regional?
This is nationally, actually.
Yeah, but I think there may be a regional component to
Oh,
that.
there will be, I'm sure, regional differences, but
Because you're saying the more rural states tend to be more Republican.
Well, the rural South.
Yeah, the rural South.
That's what would be my guess, is the rural South.
But one thing that really caught my interest too was that you made your visit to the NRA headquarters, and you also visited their opposite number at the Brady.
The Brady
organization.
Center. The Brady Center.
Right. But outside of that sort of orbit in Washington that you described, there's also been this emergence of even more, shall we say, vehement gun proponents, if you will, the gun owners of, whether it be gun owners of Wyoming, gun owners of, I've seen the
And the
organization.
Jews for the Preservation of Firearms
I'm
Ownership.
waiting to see that organization's
Yeah.
charter.
Yeah, this is not individual. This sounds like it's communitarian rather than
But-
individual.
That's it. Yeah.
It's very interesting though, because here the NRA is in a sense being outflanked
Yes.
by
Yes, among hardcore gun guys, the NRA are a bunch of milk and water sissies, that they are nowhere near
hard
the
to
most.
believe.
I know, but they are not the most extreme. There are, and really the one who is farthest, the most extreme, is the Jews for the preservation of firearms ownership. As a Jewish guy, this blew my mind, because a lot of the impetus for gun control comes from urban Jews, and yet there's this guy, Aaron Zellman. He's since passed away. I'm very sorry to say that, because he was a real gentleman. He was way out there on this issue, but a gentleman and learned, and could explain, in soft tones. He didn't pound his fist on the table. He didn't wear a gun, but he made an interesting, cogent, historical, though perhaps historians could argue about his data, historical argument about why gun laws are bad news.
I think
he was a very interesting guy. He's in the book. He was a very interesting guy to interview.
I think there's a really interesting contradiction there about this individual right, and yet all of these like-minded gun owners have to get together as one big lobby
speaking
and
of
do the
like-mindedness,
thing.
we have 1 minute left.
Oh,
And
okay.
gosh, how do we bridge this gap? You had a solution. Choose the most adamant anti-gun peacenik you know. Give him a Tommy gun to shoot up a stick of dynamite. Strap him to a polygraph and ask him if it was fun.
Yes, yes. I have found that if you take an anti-gun person out shooting, they almost always find it a hoot.
Okay, you get 30 seconds.
Well, given that I was, when I was in the Marine Corps, I was expert rifle and expert pistol. I always felt that there was a little bit of skill involved in people who were just randomly spraying the area with bullets. Didn't express to me anything but non-qual, as we'd call it in the Marine Corps.
Well,
and
we-
there's a little bit of skill in the whole business.
that is the last
Definitely.
word, unfortunately. Our thanks to our hosts here at the Cheyenne Frontier Days, Old West Museum in Cheyenne, to Phil Roberts and Dan Baum, and to you, our viewers, for taking part in this Wyoming Perspectives discussion. Good night.